As I said in a prior episode, I don't favor secession at the moment. In that episode, I laid out the basics of how secession would likely happen, where it would begin, how it would progress, its basic legal framework, and the extreme unlikelihood of a civil war. In this episode, I'm going to go into some, but by no means all, the practical steps to seceding from the United States of America. As with many things in human history, the process of secession and its likelihood at this moment comes down to one aggravating but inescapable factor: luck. And it all begins with Texas. Texas would be very likely the first domino to fall, and as luck would have it, it's also one of the youngest states in the Union. Since successful secession would have to deal with what we might call legacy costs of being part of the United States of America, youth would be a great advantage to any state wishing to secede. By legacy costs, I mean the entitlement programs that now consume, by any calculations, more than 50% of the national budget. These are financial promises that have been made mostly to the elderly and are being funded mostly by the young. Now, ordinarily, when a U.S. citizen renounces his or her citizenship, they continue to receive, for example, their Social Security benefits on the theory that they paid for them and should get their money. For the purposes of this video, we're going to assume that the United States will renege on this long-standing agreement and do everything that it can to punish those leaving the Union. And so we're going to assume that the seceding states will need to deal with these legacy costs on their own. The good news, if you can call it that, is that the true nature of funding for these entitlement programs is a lie. It's quite simply a Ponzi scheme whereby the young subsidize the old, and when these young people get old, the new young people subsidize them, and on and on and on. This obviously presents a problem because one of the first things Texas would do in seceding from the Union is to phase out the entitlement programs. Therefore, there would need to be a transition during which the young would still be paying legacy costs with no prospect of getting any of that money back. On the other hand, then this is very important, Texas has no state income tax. By moving to the new country of Texas, people would be escaping in its entirety the U.S. federal income tax, the Social Security tax, the Medicare tax, and many, many others. Think about that. The entire annual budget of the state of Texas is about $150 billion right now. But every year, residents of the state of Texas send another $300 billion, more than twice their entire annual budget, to the federal government. Now, Democrats will tell you that Texas actually operates at a deficit and receives more federal funding than it deserves. As you can imagine, this is a complete fairy tale. I'll cover this in more detail in another episode, but to summarize, it would be as though you had two children with different incomes and an uncle who sent a check to the lower earner each year to equalize things. Now, you may think that this is unfair, destructive, and counterproductive. But the uncle claims that you personally are at a deficit because you didn't send those checks that, in your opinion, never should have been sent in the first place. Ridiculous. Anyway, it is likely there would be some pain in the transition, but in any reasonable scenario, young people in Texas would be paying less in total tax than they are now, even during the legacy transition. And the amount that they pay would decline very quickly over time. There would likely be two other mitigating factors in dealing with these legacy costs: migration and debt issuance. Once it became obvious Texas was in fact going to secede, a lot of people who are relying on federal benefits would leave the state. The uncertainty would just be too much for them. And in any reasonable scenario, there's nothing that the United States could do to stop them. Simultaneously, a large number of young people wishing to extricate themselves from the United States entitlement Ponzi scheme and escape in its entirety, the federal tax system would come to Texas. Even in the worst reasonable case financial scenario, they'd be much better off. They'd come knowing that the USA's entitlement Ponzi scheme was eventually going to fall on their shoulders, and that it was better for them to get out and pay less now than to cling to some vague hope of eventual restitution. That brings us to legacy cost mitigating factor number 2, debt issuance. Milton Friedman proposed ending, for example, the Social Security system immediately and permanently by simply issuing a bond to recipients to compensate them for lost promised benefits. Entitlement benefits are nothing more than a promise of future payment, which is exactly what a bond is. The difference is that the United States hides this obligation with the Social Security Trust Fund lie so it can grossly understate the actual amount that it owes. The difference here is the bond would be issued once, the debt would be put on the state's books, and once it was paid off, the obligation would be terminated. The United States currently maintains about a $34 trillion debt, which in actuality it's much higher than that, on an annual budget of around $6 trillion, with no end in sight. Again, even in the worst reasonable case scenario, the new country of Texas, if needed, would easily be able to raise the money to smooth the transition. Which brings up the issue of the effects of Texas secession on the U.S. national debt. Of course, much of this debt was taken on by Washington, D.C., effectively against the will of the state of Texas. Nevertheless, there would need to be a negotiation to determine how much of this debt the new country of Texas would assume. Avoiding default would be in everyone's best interest. Now, there are a number of precedents for how this could be done. In the end, Texas would assume a portion of this debt, maintain interest payments to bondholders, and, as with legacy costs, retire the debt over time. I previously mentioned the hundreds of millions of dollars that are being sent to the federal government by Texas residents every year. Much of this is done involuntarily through automatic paycheck deductions. The new country of Texas would make it illegal for any employer or contractor to send an employee's money to Washington, D.C. without the written permission of that employee. This includes federal payments of any kind, including income tax, Social Security tax, Medicare. You can probably imagine how many people would participate in federal taxation once it became optional. The new country of Texas would likely adopt the United States dollar as its currency, like dozens of other countries have already done. Use of cryptocurrencies and other alternative forms of private payment would likely become more and more popular and eventually ubiquitous. I doubt the new country would actually issue its own currency, but that's yet to be determined. In terms of federal facilities now located in Texas, as a practical matter, federal facilities can't exist without the cooperation of the states in which they're located. For example, there are 15 military bases which the federal government might try to maintain for a while, or they might try to reach an agreement with the new country of Texas for them to remain there. One thing that I am sure of, military personnel in Texas will not fire on residents of Texas. Anyone who thinks this is likely does not understand the level of resolve in Texas or the lack thereof in Washington, D.C. All federal offices, courts, regulators, the IRS would be shut down as needed to be replaced by state offices. Again, the United States may make some kind of attempt to maintain this presence by continuing to pay their employees there, but it would soon become clear that this was futile and expensive. It would not continue. Will the United States go after the millions of people who are no longer paying federal tax, and by the way, no longer getting any federal benefits? Very unlikely. The optics would be terrible, and the expense would be extreme, and it would not be sustainable in the long run. The retirement plans and other assets currently held by residents of Texas in banks and institutions residing in the United States would be completely safe. To threaten those assets in any way would be economic suicide for the United States of America. All economies are mostly built on trust. Once that trust is lost, there's no limit to how bad things can get for that now untrustworthy state. For those who have doubts, the assets could always be moved to institutions based in Texas. Now, I've saved the easiest two for the last. Immigration, which I've covered in this short. It's really not that complicated. And utilities. Texas is already the only state in the union that is completely energy independent. The leftist press has made a big deal out of some blackouts that occurred a few years ago and will probably continue to occur from time to time, as though they don't happen in other places too. Texas is perfectly positioned to manage its own utilities because it's already doing that. Finally, those wishing to become citizens of the new country of Texas would need to take a loyalty pledge, much like the one currently taken by citizens of the United States. Difference is, those not upholding the pledge would be deported. And I'd suggest at least one change to the pledge language.
Michael Francis Ritchie, do you renounce?
Karl Marx.
I do renounce him.
Clearly, in any endeavor this complex, there would be unforeseen circumstances and complications. But the doomsday scenarios being discussed by the left and even some on the right are just not going to happen. What would happen is the ultimate vindication of free markets versus restricted markets. That, as well as a giant sucking sound as wealth, prosperity, and happiness fled the United States for the now free country of Texas, soon to be the free states of America.